Officer. Senator Roberts,
Thank you.
Call, and then we'll go to dinner.
Thank you. Mr. Margelis could not tell me the specific names of the experts upon which CASA relied for just turning a blind eye to Qantas and Virgin mandates, which were not government mandates. Dr. Manderson, can you tell me specifically which medical experts you relied upon for allowing Qantas and Virgin to mandate the vaccines? Who gave you the advice?
The Chief Health Officer of Australia at the time would be one important name.
Did you actually get his advice?
Senator, I think we have gone through this previously, and I appreciate...
With Mr Margelis, and he wouldn't tell me the name. So
but I think
Chief Medical Officer...
Sorry, Senator, do you want me to finish?
Do you want me to allow you to keep interrupting?
Senator Roberts, come on. You know that's against standing orders. Please.
There's been a lot of protection
Senator
of Dr.
Roberts,
Manderson.
No. Just allow Ms Spence to conclude her answer to your first question.
She's not answering my question. Dr. Manderson is.
Well, whoever was actually, I thought I heard Ms Spence, but I'll allow CASA to respond to your question. CASA?
All I was going to say, Senator, is we've tried to explain before that we don't get individual advice on specific issues. We rely on the advice of the health experts, and in this case, as Dr Manderson has said, the Chief Health Officer of Australia was basically, you know, a key source, but the TGA was also providing advice, and I think we have actually put that in response to questions, or was in some of the Hansard previously.
So it's, the reason I'm following up is Mr Margelis said that it was the experts and he wouldn't name them, and the experts wouldn't name them. So, and then we went to international experts, so I gave up then. So, okay, your answer is Chief Medical Officer, not Chief Health Officer. I presume federal you're talking about, Chief Medical Officer?
Yes, Senator.
That's important.
Yes, so Senator, perhaps you could refer me to your question specifically so that I've got in front of me what you're talking about.
Your answers...
what date was that?
I can't remember.
Because I've got Hansard in front of me.
I can't remember the date.
You can't remember. So my recollection of the conversation was that you were asking me on what basis we were taking the actions we were taking, and I told you that we were taking no actions to intervene in the Australian government's response. The advice, as Dr Manderson pointed out, about Australia's response was not being led by us, it was being led by health authorities. So we did not intervene and override advice of Australia's Chief Medical Officer or other health experts.
So you have told me that the buck for safety, the buck ends here for aviation safety. You did not do any testing at high altitude pressures, correct? So you just assumed Pfizer and the Chief Medical Officer and the TGA knew that the pressure would be okay at high altitude.
So as I was trying to explain a moment ago, what we're interested in from a vaccination or a medication perspective is it likely that you will get into a cockpit and you'll have a sudden incapacitating event and be unable to fly the plane? That's our primary concern. And for all vaccinations, including the vaccinations that were...
At altitude?
At altitude. Our primary concern was whether that medication, that vaccination would cause that event to happen. There is no evidence in Australia or anywhere around the world, and we've checked with our regulatory authorities and our colleagues in the US, in Europe, there is no evidence of that event occurring anywhere in the world over the last several years. So okay. I think we were on pretty sound footing to not intervene and prevent a particular cohort of the population from being vaccinated when that's not our role.
So let me ask you a few more questions around that, because I want you to remember at all times your answers to me, when it comes to safety, the buck stops with you, CASA. So there's no high altitude testing done that you're aware of. Are you aware that the TGA, when I asked them the question, what tests they did in Australia on the vaccines, they said they did no tests and relied on the FDA. Are you aware of that?
Senator, I reiterate what I said, that they are not matters for us. So we look at it from an aviation safety lens. And Dr Manderson has been involved in international panels looking at aviation safety on a number of different topics, so I'm sure she can step you through that. So there is no evidence whatsoever over several years now of there being an aviation safety risk. That's our concern. Whether the vaccine has other effects or other issues...
You relied upon the FDA, on the TGA. That was one of your people that you relied on. Now, the TGA admits it did no testing, and it relied upon the FDA. The FDA, prior to TGA's announcement, admitted that it did no testing and relied on, wait for it, Pfizer.
So are you suggesting...
And now we find out Pfizer in their trials had hundreds of fatalities.
Senator, I don't know how many times we can say this, but we treated the COVID vaccinations the same way we treat all vaccinations, and we don't do individual independent testing. But
okay, let me continue then.
Yes, Senator.
Are you aware of AstraZeneca being withdrawn?
Yes, Senator, but I think, Senator, sorry, I don't think it's quite as clear-cut as saying it's been withdrawn. They're no longer using it. It wasn't because they're around of an efficacy at the time, but now they're no longer producing it. But yes, we are aware.
Blood clots say anything to you? What about Novavax? We understand that's been withdrawn just recently.
I wasn't aware of that one, Senator.
Okay. Excess deaths, 13%, in line with the COVID injections. Before COVID outbreaks in Queensland and Western Australia. What would make you investigate whether or not pilots are suffering from COVID injection adverse events? Because you don't do testing on pilots, you rely upon pilots to turn themselves in.
Senator,
what would make you investigate it?
Senator, the only thing that would make us investigate if there was an adverse reaction in the cockpit which could be directly attributable to a COVID vaccination.
And what about if I told you that pilots are telling us that they know of mates who've had adverse events but they won't speak up for fear of losing their job?
I would encourage them to report on the confidential reporting arrangements that I mentioned, both with us and with the ATSB, because we're not getting those reports and there are mechanisms for them to do that.
Okay.
With pilots losing their jobs, I wonder.
Is that all you got?
Excuse me, Senator, as I said, they're confidential, so they don't need to report who they work for, but just giving us the information if that's actually occurring would be incredibly beneficial.
Given that CASA use
more minutes.
Sorry?
One more.
Austroad's fitness to drive as a guideline for recertification for TIA or stroke in Class 5 medicals, on what are the Class 1 and 2 medical recertification guidelines based, and do they differ from Class 5 guidelines? If so, and how and why?
So the Class 1 and 2, which is the commercial pilot and the private pilot medical certificates, the standards for those are based on the International Civil Aviation Organisation medical standards for certification for pilots for the commercial and private. They're quite different to the domestic Australian Class 5 medical certificate, which is not an ICAO certificate and doesn't need to comply with those medical standards. So Class 1 and Class 2 reference the international pilot standards.
And Class 5, you make up the standards?
Class 5 medical standard was developed through really extensive consultation through technical working groups with both doctors and pilots, and the operational input from pilots in particular. It also went through a really strong risk assessment process within CASA to determine what those standards should be, mapped against the risk treatments for the operational restrictions with the Class 5.
But my question was, CASA developed those standards. I'm not interested in the process. CASA developed those standards.
Yes, CASA developed those standards.
Thank you. CASA allow airlines to push pilots to the limit as a routine practice. This is facilitated by a concession given to the airlines masquerading as, quote, fatigue risk management. CASA have allowed airlines to use this system as a shield when continuing to roster pilots to fly unreasonably long hours. Do Class 5 medical holders and Class 1 and 2 medical holders operate in the same airspace?
So, Senator Roberts, what were you quoting? Was it a... Because for the benefit of the witnesses, I think they'd like to see some of the source of that quotes.
I'm not quoting from anything here. My research assistant.
Okay.
No, I'm not quoting.
Oh, okay.
I was quoting the fatigue risk management title.
So, for the record, we don't agree with the statement you just said.
Do Class 5 medical holders and Class 1 and 2 medical holders operate in the same airspace?
Yes, they do.
Thank you. Is a Class 5 medical holder a single pilot operation?
Yes.
Yes, it is, yeah.
Okay. You had some doubts, Dr. Manderson.
I think they answered the
Sorry,
question.
only because I felt it was self-evident, but yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. So, if a Class 5 medical holder with a recent history of stroke or TIA, after 4 weeks of grounding, is back in an aeroplane at the holding point at an airport and has a relapse, his or her aircraft taxis out in front of the landing heavy jet fully laden. Class 1 and 2 medical holders can operate with multi-crew and autopilots, as well as current pilots repositioning as passengers in the cabin on numerous flights. Class 5 pilots have no backup. Is that correct so far?
Senator,
Perhaps you could repeat the question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the question was in that.
We've got a heavy laden jet coming into land, and we've got with Class 1 and 2 medical holders, and we've got with other backups on their position, and we've got a Class 5 just about to go in front of the path, and they have a
I think that's
relapse.
Senator, it feels like you're describing, without being derogatory, a weekend warrior landing in the same place as a large commercial air transport operator, and I'm just trying to...
Okay, let's continue then. We'll get on to your weekend warriors. What value does CASA place on the designated medical examiner's ability to diagnose and recertify pilots? And what situations require CASA to intervene with their diagnosis?
So the designated aviation medical examiners are absolutely fundamental to us being able to make safe decisions about issuing medical certificates. They are the doctors that perform the examination and interact with the pilots and air traffic controllers at every medical certificate renewal application, and we trust their assessment as clinicians as to whether or not there is any medically significant or safety relevant medical condition present in that pilot or air traffic controller applicant, and we take their clinical information and their advice when we decide whether or not to issue a medical certificate.
Why then is CASA advocating self-certification for Class 5 medicals, as I understand it?
Senator, we're not advocating. What we're presenting is options for different types of operations. So a pilot that chooses to operate with a single passenger in a light aircraft can choose a Class 5 certificate, or they can choose any other certificate. So we're not advocating any particular medical. We're creating options and different pathways for different pilots in different circumstances, and those circumstances are adjusted based on risk, and the level of medical certification.
And Senator, this has been a matter that's been under debate for a number of years around CASA being a proportionate regulator and people being able to operate the way, putting restrictions around, identifying. If we say that under the Class 5 medical we put restrictions on the way in which you can operate, therefore you can operate within those constraints, and then we will review to see how that's working over time, and we're monitoring it closely to make sure that, you know, we're auditing people's self-declarations and the like. So I think, you know, people do expect us to be a proportionate risk-based regulator, and I think the Class 5 medical is an example of how we can do that.
So that's what I'm exploring here. I'm trying to understand. I'm not a pilot. Considering CASA AVMED can override opinions of consulting physicians and specialists during the medical renewal process, how could the view of a CASA AVMED doctor come to its own diagnosis of an individual pilot in the absence of face-to-face consultation overrule the opinions of independent specialists and consultants? Is that possible?
The aeromedical decision-making process is more than and different to the clinical decision-making process. So our medical assessment process that we're required to follow by the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations and the ICAO standards and recommended practices is that we take all of the advice that's available from all of the clinicians, including their expert opinions, the investigations and reports that are available, the medical examination from the DAME, and we apply that information against the medical standard for medical certification. The key difference is that the medical specialists who are seeing the patient and the patient pilot or controller, they are performing an assessment of the medical status of that person as a clinician for diagnosis and management, but not for aeromedical risk assessment and not for medical certification processes. So it's quite a different role and a different process. We consider their advice, but their advice is about the condition and its disease and severity, not about its safety relevance for medical certification.
Now, Senator Roberts, we need to break for dinner. Are you close to finishing, or because
we might come and put these on next Senate estimates?
If you wouldn't mind, that would be great. So I know I promised 10 minutes, but I've actually given you close to 15. But
thank you very much.
No, you're more than welcome.